Good evening and welcome. My introduction tonight would be brief, except that I have a letter I want to read for, I think, a good reason. North Country Peace Campaign, the local affiliate of Indochina Peace Campaign and a task force of the New American Movement here in Minneapolis, has been working now for almost a year under the same in the same ways that Indochina Peace Campaign, who the touring group tonight represent. In the course of that work, we've done a certain amount of congressional lobbying, if you want to call it that, as well as a great deal of attempting to mobilize opinion through speaking and slideshows and films and presentations of a smaller but similar kind that you'll see tonight. During that year, we've had a kind of working relation in a weird sort of way with the local congressional representative of our district, or who claims to represent our district, Don Fraser. And just recently, we sent him a letter concerning both impeachment campaign that North Country Peace Campaign has been working on, and ending aid to the two regime and the political prisoner issue, which we'll hear about tonight. We sent him a letter before this meeting quite a few weeks ago, as a matter of fact, and we've been waiting for a reply, and we haven't got it. And I'd like to read the letter tonight and ask you, before you leave, to sign it with us so that we can send it back again to him, this time with more than just North Country Peace Campaign and the few people who signed it originally, so that maybe we'll get a response once again from him. Also because reading the letter, I think, kind of encapsulates what North Country Peace Campaign has been trying to do in the last few months. And then I'll introduce the tour. Dear Congressman Fraser, since meeting with you several weeks ago, our impeachment campaign has continued and gathered new momentum. The neighborhood speakouts that we sponsored, in which none of your representatives attended, were well attended with people anxious to begin work with the campaign in their neighborhoods and workplaces. Our local efforts are being expanded statewide, and through the country, NAM chapters are beginning to work themselves. We want to meet with you or your aides again as Congress reconvenes to receive the formal public statement that you promised at our last meeting. We will have a representative from our chapter in Washington in September, and will also want to meet here in Minneapolis. Will you be available for such a meeting immediately before Congress reconvenes, or perhaps on a weekend in September? He wasn't. We will ask you at that time for a formal public statement to the press supporting impeachment and/or a speech on the floor of Congress calling for impeachment and support for efforts already underway, the Drinan Resolution, etc. We understand and are sympathetic to the concerns you express to us and to other constituents, some of who have shown us letters from you, that a move for impeachment be well-founded and effective. But to ask that we as your constituents wait for a move by some anonymous moderate Republican leaves us with no effective representation of our own, and we are concerned also with how the impeachment resolution is drawn, with what charges will be considered for debate. It is reasonably certain that no photographs of Richard Nixon wearing headphones will be produced by the investigation. Allegations of specific actions by Nixon, e.g. the bribery of Judge Byrne, the approval of the 1970 police state plans and operations, etc., might prove to be enough for impeachment, and are certainly of great concern to us, as his impoundment of funds, the secret bombing of Cambodia, and other actions are already admitted. But impeachment proceedings should be held in such a way as to allow the Congress and the people of this country, more importantly, the opportunity to re-examine and reject criminal policies of the last decade of our history, the entire illegal conduct of the war against the Indo-Chinese people, the attack on the living standard of working people and the democratic rights of the opposition in this country, policies of government secrecy and lying, the subservience of government to major corporations like ITT, etc. The exact bill of impeachment remains for Congress to draw and act upon more directly, threatened by the prospect, to act upon, and we are as concerned as you about effectively removing Nixon from office, and perhaps more directly threatened by the prospect of his policies remaining in effect. But we also hope that impeachment proceedings can be used to begin to change the basic drift of this country, so that whoever succeeds Nixon will actually be more representative and responsive to the American people, rather than simply more careful and even more secretive and repressive. If you will lend your support to impeachment moves in Congress, we will continue our local, statewide, and national campaign to educate and mobilize people about the issues raised by Watergate. We'll continue to raise them whether he does or not. Our efforts so far show there is great public rage about the very basic subversion of democracy by the Nixon administration, and a willingness and openness to reassess much of our recent history and take actions to shape the history now being made. We hope that Congress shares some of that courage and determination. We will continue. One of the charges listed on the petitions that we presented to you, we presented Fraser with 5,000 signatures to begin with, was Nixon's imposition of an unpopular and undemocratic regime on the people of South Vietnam and Cambodia. We have spoken to you about cutting off aid to two in the past. Last Christmas you responded that some economic aid to the Saigon regime actually served a humanitarian purpose, aiding refugees and so on. But recently the Farm Bill, S-1888, was passed by Congress containing cover-up aid for two, and specifically for funding his prisons and police. The so-called Food for Peace program provides that food purchased with American taxpayers' money is given to the two government. Two sells the food for Vietnamese piasters, and the money is earmarked for military and police expenditure. Frequently, the money is paid to American corporations that render some service to the two police state, as the case of the RMK BRJ Tiger Cage contract. $137.4 million of Food for Peace funds have been earmarked for South Vietnamese military spending in the fiscal year 1974, next year. $24.7 million is authorized for Cambodia. Senator Proxmire mounted a challenge against the use of Food for Peace funds to finance two's police state in this session of Congress. He amended the Farm Bill to the effect that no Food for Peace fund shall be, quote, used for the purpose of procuring any equipment, materials, facilities, or services for any military or defense purposes, including internal security, end of quote. It passed the Senate by unanimous vote. The Farm Bill passed the House with no such amendment. In the conference committee, the amendment was dropped. Key representatives from this area really helped to push the Farm Bill through. We can only conclude that all peace-loving members of the House were negligent in this matter and hope that it may be possible to reverse this action. On a broader level, that action only illustrates what we argued last December, that any aid to a dictatorship will be used against the people of that country and against the interests and best aspirations of the people of this country. Nixon will continue to disguise his aid to two in many ways, especially as pressure to cut off aid mounts. Any aid to two is an actual violation of the Paris Agreement, specifically Article 9C, which reads, quote, foreign countries shall not impose any political tendency or personality on the South Vietnamese people, end of quote. Aid to two is aid to a police state that maintains its power by imprisonment of 200,000 by its best and own approximation. Political prisoners in torturous situations like the tiger cages now being constructed with U.S. aid money. How can any aid to such a regime be regarded as humanitarian? Many bills you will consider this fall will pertain to this question. Will you now support all efforts to cut off aid to all sorts to the two regime? Will you speak out about the plight of the political prisoners and offer legislation yourself? Will you, if we provide the names, read into the congressional record the names and locations of some of the prisoners? In the past, such publicity has lessened their torture. We expect and hope that you will. Perhaps you could send a formal statement of your determination to us for public use during the International Days of Concern, which we will be participating in with Tom Hayden, Jane Fonda, Jean Debris, Marianne Hamilton, and others on September 21st, 22nd. we will include with this letter some of the materials we've been distributing in Minneapolis and have taken Xerox conversations with people we meet in our work. We have received to date no reply from Congressman Fraser to this letter, and we'd kind of like to send it back to him, having publicly aired it with a letter to that effect, and with as many signatures from you, and I'll put the letter in the back at one of the tables, that we can get from you after you've heard tonight's presentation, which I think will support the substance of this letter. Also, there are several items that you should have. No one should leave without these two items: the war, the Watergate, the cause is war, and no peace, no honor. Also, at the end of the program, you can look at sample letters, one to a prisoner in South Vietnam and one to a congressman, which we urge you to fill out, or to at least use as some kind of basis to think about writing your own. Okay, now for a brief introduction. And I hope that the presentation tonight compels you to join with us in our campaign. We don't only put pressure on unresponsive congressmen, but it's still worth doing that because we have seen Fraser move a little bit by little bit, and we think others could. But we, the people, have to keep pushing. Tonight you'll be hearing Tom Hayden, an author and longtime anti-war activist, Jane Fonda, also a consistent anti-war activist, as well as an Academy Award-winning actress, Jean-Pierre Debray, a Frenchman who is jailed in one of two prisons for 2 years after participating in an anti-war demonstration in Saigon, and Holly Near and her accompanist Jeff Langley. Holly's an actress and a singer whose new album, Hang In There, is on sale at the literature tables, and I think after you've heard her sing tonight, you really want to buy it. Their visit to the Twin Cities is one stop on a tour taking them through 25 cities this fall, and the objective of the tour is to once again talk to people about the war, the situation that Watergate presents us, and especially to focus attention on the issue of political prisoners in South Vietnam. The tour is not just a one-shot campaign, but also represent Tom's and Jane's year-and-a-half-long effort to build an ongoing peace organizational network across the country, of which North Country Peace Campaign has been affiliated. So, without saying any more, I'd really like to hear a warm welcome for Tom Hayden, Jane Fonda, Jean-Pierre Debray, Holly Near, and Jeff Langley.
Thank you. This is going to be a long evening, and we want to have a lot of time for questions and answers. So I'm going to cut down very, very quickly to the major points by way of introduction. We are, as you now have been told, campaigning and trying to work with a network of groups across the country who are campaigning around what we believe to be the main obstacle now to the achievement of real peace in Indochina. I don't think that here we have to labor the fact that there still is a ways to go in Indochina, nor many of the reasons why, but in particular I'd like to stress 3 points in terms of the reasons why we have to go on. The first is what you're going to hear documented tonight, and that is the obstacle to peace that is represented by the confinement under unbelievable conditions of perhaps 200,000 political prisoners in South Vietnam who should have been released at the time of the peace agreement. If they are released, they most certainly will be released as a part of world pressure. And that pressure is being mounted in particular this week, which is International Week of Concern about their lives and their fate. And if they are released, they will take part in the construction of the National Council of Reconciliation, which is prescribed in the peace agreement signed last January, which will establish the machinery for elections in South Vietnam to elect a government. If they are not released, if they are detained indefinitely, if their conditions worsen as they have since January, then we can take that as a sign that the U.S. administration in Washington is backing a regime in Saigon that is intent upon violating the agreement. If that agreement is violated, we will most certainly find our country pulled back into a question of intervening with B-52s, fighter planes, more advisors, and what have you. So the options boil down to an either-or. Either world pressure, including pressure from this country, puts enough pressure on Washington and Saigon to make them comply with the agreement, or if they do not comply with the agreement and the misery continues in South Vietnam, we have to build the climate of opinion in this country that will oppose any reintervention by our country when the fighting breaks out again, as it inevitably will on a very large and serious scale if the agreement is not implemented. When the agreement was signed, the Vietnamese in the north and the Vietnamese in the south on the other side, who signed the agreement under the name of their foreign minister, Mrs. Bin, representing the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam, made an appeal to world opinion to do something about the plight of the prisoners in South Vietnam. This fact alone shows that the peace agreement that was signed with the signature of the U.S. Secretary of State was not considered to be the end of the long struggle in Vietnam, but merely a marker along the way, and that there would be a further struggle to implement it. And that is what Indochina Peace Campaign and other peace organizations are trying to do. So the first thing that concerns us is the plight of the prisoners, and the second is the fact that our country is going to be re-involved in Indochina with all that that means. And the third reason that brings us here and leads us to do our work is the significance of the Indochina conflict for our generation and for the world. So deep a significance that we believe that if the violence were to end, even tonight, there would be a tremendously important conflict over the interpretation and meaning of the war. In some ways, the period after a war for Americans is just as important as the period of the war itself. I can illustrate that from my own experience, having been raised in the 40s, being a child of the Second World War. When that war was over, I received most of my conditioning about Asian people. In the late 1940s, after watching a sufficient number of John Wayne films and other films about Japanese attacking Americans, screaming banzai and so forth, I developed nightmares that basically I think had remained suppressed in me ever since, until the Indochina War made me remember how I was conditioned. And in these nightmares, I would be asleep, safe in America, and suddenly there would be an airplane alert. The Japanese planes would be carrying out a Pearl Harbor type surprise attack on Royal Oak, Michigan, where I lived. We would only have seconds to escape. I would be out of bed and out the window and trying to run through the fields. Being about 6 years old, it wasn't so easy. And they would be coming behind me screaming banzai, which they always did in the films of them that I saw once a week for 10 cents at the neighborhood theater. And I would run and run, but there was really no getting away from them, because we were conditioned to believe that since they didn't care about human life, they would sacrifice their own lives by the thousands in order to catch us. And invariably, I would just wake up screaming as they were about to do something to me after having caught me. And I don't think that that was an unusual personal experience at all. I say it because perhaps it will remind you of some of your childhood memories. It was in that climate that the Cold War began. It was in that climate that it was possible for a congressman on the floor of the House of Representatives to argue in 1948 that in Southeast Asia we should never let ourselves be bullied by any yellow dwarf with a knife. The man who said that on the floor of the House of Representatives was Lyndon Johnson. It was possible in that climate for Time magazine to write off Ho Chi Minh as a Mongoloid Trotskyite. Many things were possible in that time. But this is a different time, a very, very profoundly changed one. Not different absolutely, but a new time that has been born out of the times that I grew up in. In 1945, two very important things happened that seem very, very remote to anyone living in America, and today we see them coming together in a very profound clash. First, at the end of World War II, while other Western societies like Great Britain, after a debate, dissolved their intelligence agencies, the United States decided to make the CIA permanent. The United States decided to make the Pentagon and the Department of Defense permanent. We established agencies for clandestine warfare, agencies for the gathering of intelligence. And into those agencies in the period 45 to 50, a lot of people were attracted, including people like E. Howard Hunt, James McCord, what could be described as the early generation of the final Watergate conspiracy. In the late 1940s, a young man from Whittier, California, Richard Nixon, ran for public office for the first time in a climate generated by the beginning of the Cold War, a climate of anti-communism. At the same time that this was happening, from 1945 to 49 and 50, across the globe in a place that was truly obscure to Americans who had gone through World War II, in a country called Vietnam, a person by the name of Ho Chi Minh stood at a podium in Hanoi, started reading from the introductory words to the American Declaration of Independence, which were the prelude to the Declaration of Independence of the Vietnamese people, who formed there that day the Democratic Republic of Vietnam after fighting underground for 5 years, after fighting against the French in one form or another for 80 years. This republic was geographically located from one end of Vietnam to the next. There was no north, there was no south. The French had tried to administratively divide the country into 3 parts and had failed. New committees of the new administration emerged in the Mekong Delta. The flag of the liberation forces, then called the Viet Minh, flew in Saigon. The same kind of committees unfurled their flags, opened their offices, and began to function in places called Da Nang and Hue, not simply in the north. It was the first socialist country to declare its independence in the wake of World War II. The first third world country to become fully independent in the beginning of an era when many, many, many of them in Asia, Africa, and Latin America would become independent and take their seats at the newly formed United Nations, which, by the way, had its first meetings in San Francisco in 1945, some of which were chaired by a young man from the Department of State by the name of Alger Hiss, quickly accused later by Nixon and McCarthy of being the Daniel Ellsberg of his time, conspiring to send secrets to our enemies. In that vortex of World War II came the ingredients of the biggest conflict that has occupied the world and occupied the lives of Americans of our generation. Between the independence movements located in the third world of Asia, Africa, and Latin America on the one hand, and the clandestine services and special agencies and military departments of the Western powers on the other. And it has been the case, as you know, that the Vietnamese and the people of Indochina in general have borne the heaviest burden of this conflict, having to first fight against the French, defeat them militarily, make compromises for the sake of the struggle ahead, then see the American dollars and American weapons and finally American troops come in and have to fight the American forces. Nearly all the time of the majority of Vietnamese in our lifetime has been occupied with fighting against either the French or the Americans. And in that process, they have gained a worldwide recognition of having played a unique role, which many of us are blind to, but we ought not to be, because they find themselves at the focal point of our contemporary history, the center of the stage of the big conflict between the Western foreign policies of colonialism and the national independence movements of the world. And that still is the case, the conflict not being resolved. And as that conflict has grown through our lives and made its reappearance in the Algerian Revolution, in the Cuban Revolution, finally become enlarged to almost dominate us completely in the 60s in the form of the Vietnam and Indochinese wars, a countercurrent of reaction has built up, one wave after another, finally coming to also create a climax in our lives known as Watergate. The first generation of the CIA, the lifetime careerists like Hunt and McCord, they joined in the 40s. The young conservatives of Southern California, the beginnings of the Cold War, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, they joined at the time that Nixon said the United States had lost China. Then came Algeria and Cuba, and a new generation with help from some of the old crystallized around the attempt to sabotage the Cuban Revolution. Sturgis, Martinez, Hunt again, Liddy, Richard Nixon, the chief operations officer of the Bay of Pigs, planning while being Vice President of the United States. Then, lo and behold, within America, the threat they had been talking about for the entire Cold War suddenly materialized in the form of the Civil Rights Movement and the New Left. And another wave of reaction started in the form of Young Americans for Freedom. Tom Charles Houston, the man who by 1970 was pulling together all the clandestine agencies to work out the master plan for violating the law in order to crack down on radicals, was one of the early national chairmen and founders of Young Americans for Freedom. Its founding convention was a literal reaction to the formation of Students for a Democratic Society. We wrote the Port Huron Statement, they wrote the Sharon Statement. Sharon being the name of the town where the estate of the Buckley family is, where they held their founding convention. Among their sponsors were E. Howard Hunt. Among their founding members were Douglas Caddy, who later shared a so-called advertising office space, public relations space in a building downtown Washington, D.C. with Hunt. Hunt being a very close friend of the Buckley family, now the custodian of the family affairs, now that Mrs. Hunt is dead and Mr. Hunt is in prison. Douglas Caddy, at 5 a.m. on June 18, 1972, showed up at the Washington police station to bail out the Watergate conspirators. Another founder of Young Americans for Freedom in the early days. So it went with each wave of success in the Third World, there came a spillover effect of new consciousness inside the United States, and with each wave there came a counter-reaction, an attempt to suppress, sometimes successful as Howard Hunt was in Guatemala, overthrowing the legitimately elected government of Arbenz in the 50s. Sometimes it was a failure, as at the Bay of Pigs. But these forces have grown. The force of empire, which includes secrecy, clandestine warfare, deceit, and the rigging of American public opinion, the manipulation of the two-party system and the press, and the force of revolution, which challenges all of that and makes people begin to wonder. And they have come to a clash because of the Vietnam War. Because in 1968, when Richard Nixon was elected with a secret plan to end the war and had none, he met in the Hotel Pierre in New York City with Henry Kissinger, Daniel Ellsberg, and others. Discussed with them what his real plans were for the next 4 years. They included the following. 1, invade Laos. 2, secretly bomb Cambodia. 3, send Navy frogmen into Haiphong Harbor to let the North Vietnamese and the Russians know that we are not going to consider that inviolate, but we are going to attack it if they don't give up. If you were elected president on a plan for achieving peace and you decided to expand the war to 2 countries and provoke the socialist camp by mining Haiphong Harbor, you would have one remaining problem: the American people, who didn't know anything about it and couldn't be allowed to know anything about it. And from that meeting came the necessity of all the plans for the control of public opinion, the breaking up of the anti-war movement by any means, including the conspiracy indictments that were ordered a month later by John Mitchell, even the rigging of establishment political parties, manipulation of the press, came from that meeting. So, we say that the roots of the Watergate crisis can be found in the Indochina crisis, and if we're concerned about eliminating Watergate-type manipulation from our life, we have to be concerned about eliminating its causes, which lie in the attempt to build an empire of unpopular regimes around the world, so unpopular that their nature has to be kept from the American people. When General Pugh was elected in 1971 in his so-called election against himself, Richard Nixon, then president, was asked how he could justify American tax dollars supporting a dictatorship. He gave an answer that I think you should all be familiar with. He said, if we use the standards of democracy and justice as a criteria for which countries around the world we give aid and support to, why, we wouldn't be able to support more than a quarter or a third of the countries we do everywhere in the world. We simply can't use those standards for deciding what our national interest is. These are the ideological assumptions of people who believe that even a cruel fascist dictatorship is worse than a country that is nationalist with a government that includes communists. And you must ask yourself this question as you hear what you're about to hear tonight. If you were living in the 30s or 40s, someone said to you, you have a choice to spend your tax dollars, which now are going to the Hitler regime, including its prison system, or you can withdraw those dollars so that there might come to power a government in Germany that would include socialists and communists. If you were faced with that choice and you were an American at that time, I think that you would not have chosen to support Hitler. And it is the same choice today, democracy or empire, that is very heavily upon us. In order to make this absolutely apparent, we have to be willing to listen to things that other people experience, but often we don't want to hear about. like torture, like repression. We have to open ourselves to listening to things that are so horrible that we will doubt that any American actually does them, perhaps. There is no other way to get to the bottom of things, though, except to go to the bottom. So we start tonight with an eyewitness account by a person who is, I think, unique in the West. The only person I know of, except the person who was jailed with him, who is a white person, a Westerner, available to us in America, who has seen firsthand the conditions in the jails of South Vietnam that President Nixon calls peace with honor. I'd like to introduce him to you, Jean-Pierre Debris.
I arrived first in South Vietnam to work as a French teacher in 1968. What I discovered first was the corruption of the Thieu regime. I was responsible for a French exam called baccalaureate, and I was approached many times by South Vietnamese senators who tried, or some officials inside the Thieu regime, who tried to buy from me this exam for their sons, so that they could evade the draft, go abroad to study, while the peasant sons were dying on the battlefront. The price of this exam in 1970 was 1 million piastres, around $3,000. Then I traveled a lot in the countryside on a little motorcycle, and I was really shocked by the war. It's a very common sight in South Vietnam to see in the morning along the road bodies being exposed, the result of the so-called body count campaign. Bodies being exposed, mutilated with knives, sometimes cigarettes being put in their mouth, exposed along the roads, not only for 1 day, but for 2 days, 3 days, so that everybody, every car has to slow down on the road and everybody can see. So I decided on the 25th of July 1970 with another French teacher to demonstrate for peace in Saigon, just in front of the National Assembly. We distributed leaflets written in Vietnamese, which title was Hòa bình, which means peace, in which we asked for the withdrawal of all foreign troops from South Vietnam. We were, of course, immediately beaten by the Saigon police, uniformed police, and police in civilian clothes, secret police, beaten with rocks, with iron bars, with clubs, until we fell unconscious. And then we were jailed during 2.5 years in the biggest prison in Saigon, which is called the Kiwa prison. We were released only on the 29th of December 1972, just 1 month before the ceasefire. And the only reason we could find for our release was that we were going to be the embarrassing witnesses of the liquidation of all the political prisoners inside this prison. After being arrested by the Saigon police, we were brought to the police station of the 1st district, very near from the American embassy in Saigon. That's where we witnessed the first torture inside this prison. During 5 mornings, the policemen brought a so-called Viet Cong suspect. They laid him on a bench, his hands and his feet tied under the bench. They spread a dirty rag on his face, covering his nose and his mouth. A policeman pulled the hair of the suspect against the bench, while another one was pouring continuously soapy water, so that the prisoner had to swallow the liquid by his nose and by his mouth if he wanted to breathe a little. And when the prisoner was about to faint out, they would gag his mouth with the dirty rag, and they jumped on his stomach and they eat his ribs, so that the prisoner had to re-vomit the liquid by his nose. Then we were brought to the Tiwa prison. Tiwa in Vietnamese means a will of peace, a will of concord. This is not called by the Thieu regime by the word prison. They will say that this is a re-education center. And re-education means for all the political prisoners that they had to salute the Saigon flag every morning at 6:30. In the center of the prison, there is a big tower with 4 loudspeakers where they will play the national anthem at 6:30. Every political prisoner had to stand at attention to salute the Saigon flag. Those who refused to salute the Saigon flag, those who refused to be re-educated, were called obstinate by the Thieu regime. And they were put for 2 months, 3 months in a special room in the ED sector. This room was called by the Vietnamese the movie room. In fact, it was the torture room. But when an official delegation would come inside the prison authorities would put away all the torture instruments. They would set up a projector in the center of the room. They would unfold a screen on the wall, and they would say, "This is a movie room." This room could contain between 300 and 400 prisoners, shackled on a iron bar running along the wall. There were various positions for the prisoners to be shackled. One was the hands and the feet tied together, so that the prisoner could only sleep on his side. Another one was the hands tied behind his back, like this. And I have known many of my friends who spent months, even years like this, because they refused to salute the Saigon flag. In the Tiwa prison, there was even an official job, which is called in Vietnamese Ban Thuyen Mon. It means the specialist. And these people are specialists of tortures. Names are well known in this Tiwa prison. I can give you a few names: Sao Dang, Nam Lung. These people are common criminals, being used as security forces by the prison authorities, a kind of trusty prisoners. And they are those who beat the political prisoners every morning if they refuse to salute the Saigon flag. What we discovered during these 2.5 years we spent in the Tiwa prison was that there were many ways to kill these political prisoners. We witnessed one time in the yard of the FG sector, trusty prisoners came and they break with a pick the lock of a cell where Buddhist monks were jailed. Then they dragged out one of these Buddhist monks. 2 of the trusty prisoners spread the arms of the Buddhist monks inside the FG yard. And then another one with the pick gave blows. The first blows, the Buddhist monk could avoid them. The third one, he take it inside his stomach and then on his head, and he died in front of the eyes of 9,000 prisoners. The guards had run away. In the Phu Quoc Island, since September of 1971, the commander of the camp gave the order during repression to shoot on the political prisoners. And they will shoot with machine guns, lower and lower, so that the political prisoners have to lie down on the ground. Every time there are dozens of prisoners being killed. But for us, I think that the cruelest way we have seen, which was used to kill these political prisoners, what I like to call as a policy of slow death. They would kill these political prisoners by giving them no food at all. Only rice and a pinchful of salt. Water was rationed. They would kill them by giving them no medicine at all. Sicknesses are provoked sicknesses. Because the prisoners are beaten on their lungs, they will vomit blood. And then they are put in damp cells, so that almost all of them had tuberculosis. On a cell we knew well, cell OB1. There were 25 prisoners, 23 had tuberculosis. And then they would mix already sick and contagious prisoners with the other prisoners, so that everybody would get tuberculosis. In this model prison, it has to have a dispensary. I was surprised to see on the report from Senator Kennedy on the 4th of June in front of the American Senate to hear about the amount of dollars supposedly given for this dispensary of the Tiwa prison. I knew well this dispensary. When a political prisoner would ask for medicine, they would say to him, "The American has cut the head. No medicine for you." One time, a team of 3 American people working in the AID program came to visit this dispensary. And a woman, prisoner, a well-known lawyer, whose name was Mrs. Ngobatam. She graduated from the Columbia University and she could speak fluent English. She managed to reach these 3 American guys. She denounced the fact that there were no medicine at all inside the dispensary. Then she was surrounded by the trustee prisoners. The 3 American people left immediately and she was beaten by the trustee prisoners. She even managed to send a letter to Ambassador Bunker. Nothing was never made to improve the conditions. When the daily ration decreased, then the political prisoners will protest, will struggle to get their daily ration increased. And repression began. I've seen more than 10 times a repression inside the prison. First, the 4 loudspeakers from the central tower will play American music to cover the voices of the political prisoners who shout slogans. I can even remember the name of one of these records, The House of the Rising Sun. And then trustee prisoners came inside the yard. They lined up in front of the cells of the political prisoners, armed with clubs, with iron bars, even knives. And the political prisoners barricaded inside their cells. They would try to speak with them. They would say to them, "Brothers, look, we have nothing in our hands. We don't want to fight with you. What we are asking is more food, or to be allowed to go in the yard for walking in the morning." The trustee prisoners never listened to them. They would begin to pour quicklime inside the cells of the political prisoners. They would throw vomitive grenades until all the political prisoners inside were burned and blind by the quicklime, and until all fell unconscious. Then they would drag them by their feet inside the yard, and they will go on beating them. This policy of re-education is aimed solely at breaking the patriotic spirit of these political prisoners. What they want to do is to break them not only physically, but also morally. But what I have to say is what impressed us the most during these 2.5 years was the courage of these political prisoners. We met with prisoners who had spent already 10 years, 15 years in jail and could still smile. They would still resist to this policy of re-education. When we left, almost all the prisoners were still refusing to salute the Saigon flag. And for us, the symbol of their resistance, the symbol of their suffering, was the children that we met inside the Tiwa prison. Because you can find children considered as political prisoners inside these cells. There were 50 of them in the EH sector. And I'd like to speak about one of them, the youngest one, whose name was Zung Van Shao. When we met him, he was 7 years old, a political prisoner. He was arrested with his father. At first, the policeman tried to make him say with whom his father was speaking, who were the friends of his father. Little Sao refused to speak. At first he was given candies by the policeman. But then, because he was still refusing to speak, then he was tortured exactly the same way as they torture grown-ups. He had his hands tied behind his back. The torture that the policeman called the airplane trip. They tied his hands behind his back, and with a long rope going to the ceiling, they hung him from the ceiling. They make him swing in the air. And then with clubs, with truncheons, they beat on their lungs, on his lungs, and then with lighted cigarettes, they burn sensitive parts of his body. Little Sao told us that the policemen, while they were torturing him, they told him, "You know, Sao, your hands are very little, but they are large enough to take a gun. That's why I'm beating you now." What impressed us the most was that these children were organizing themselves inside their cells. They would elect a child delegate from the cell to discuss with the colonel the conditions of their detention. They would wait until night, at 10 or 11 during the night, when all the prison is silent. And then they began to shout slogans, asking for more food or water, which was ration. When paper and pencils were forbidden inside the prison, they still tried to educate themselves. One of the children, more educated than the others, would teach the others how to read or how to write. What you have to know is that although the conditions are so terrible inside the cell, poems are still written, patriotic songs, and even national feasts, revolutionary feasts, are being celebrated inside the cells. What they had learned, although they were so young, was that to survive, they had to struggle. And to struggle, solidarity was necessary. Around all these children, there was a kind of a chain of solidarity from the other political prisoners to try to bring to them medicine, to bring to them more food. That's why, because of this solidarity between all the political prisoners inside the prison, regardless of their social origin or their religious belief, that's why I'm still confident concerning the outcome of their struggle inside the prison. When I was in the Tiwa prison, we met with all kinds of prisoners. There were even Catholic priests, Buddhist monks. In this country, in the American newspapers, and according to what Q is saying, there are only communists inside the cells. I met with all kinds of prisoners, lawyers, my own lawyer. When I had my trial, I had no defense counsel at all at first. I was given a 4-year sentence. When I appealed my sentence, I took a Vietnamese attorney, whose name is Nguyen Long. He was immediately arrested, and he's still now in jail in the Tiwa prison. We met with professors, with intellectuals, Catholic students, peasants, workers. All these people would call themselves as criminals of peace. Mr. Nguyen Long, my own lawyer, told me, in Nuremberg, they judge criminals of war. We are criminals of peace. These people belong to the third force, and they are very necessary to the reconciliation and the national concord in South Vietnam. But Mr. Thieu knows that if he releases all these people, his government will collapse. If he wants to survive politically, he cannot release these people. Just 1 month before I was expelled from the prison, the Thieu regime began to reclassify all these political prisoners into common criminals. They would mix political prisoners with common criminals so that fights were provoked among the two categories of prisoners. And after the fights, these prisoners were classified as common criminals. And you can understand easily why it was done. These political prisoners changed into common criminals will not be released after the ceasefire. I met with students inside the Thieu prison, and I would like to speak about one of them, whose name was Nguyen Ngoc Phuong. He was arrested in March of 1970 with his wife, Cao Thi Queung. They were tortured in front of each other. First, the policeman tied the hand of Phuong on the table. They spread his fingers so that he couldn't move no more, his fingers. And then they inserted needles under his nails. At the extremity of the needle, they put small pieces of paper, and then they move a fan in front of the pieces of paper, so that the needles are more and more driven under the nail. Phuong told me how he could stand the torture not more than 15 minutes before he fainted out. His wife, forced to see the torture being made on his husband, was then forced to stand naked in front of the policeman. And then she was tortured exactly the same way as her husband. And because she was exhausted, she couldn't defend herself, she was then raped by the policeman. What you have to know is that now in South Vietnam, for all these student girls, rape is systematic. There is even a service, a special service from the National Police, Service F05 in the Saigon area, with a policeman called Dung Van Thien, specialized in the interrogation of all these students. And this policeman would thrust into the vagina of the student girls Coca-Cola bottles or even living eels. Among the more than 200,000 prisoners in South Vietnam, what you have to know is more than half of them are women. We met with some of them in cell OB4. The first time we had seen women, we have seen one of them who suffered an epileptic fit. We were told by the other woman that she had been tortured with electricity. She was, the policeman attached electrodes to her breast, and then she was administered electric shocks. Because she was pregnant when she was arrested, and when the baby was born, she couldn't breastfeed the baby because her breasts were so painful from the torture. And so the baby died inside the cell. And the woman kept the body of the baby inside the cells for 2 days, protesting against the administration of the prison. We met also with all men, all prisoners. One of them, whose name was Nguyen Van Day, was 67 years old. He had been already jailed for 17 years, 9 years in the tiger cages. He told me how during the first resistance against the French colonialists, he was arrested by the French legionaries. They hung him from the ceiling with 1 foot. for 2 days and 2 nights. And then he had his foot amputated. But he told me, I cannot be hateful toward the French people, nor the American people for what they did in this country. We must distinguish, we can distinguish between the American people and the American government. When we left the prison, they cried when he saw us leaving, because he considered himself as our grandfather. Before I left, I knew that he was beginning to learn the English language. So, if I am here today, it's to tell to the American public opinion, to tell to the American taxpayers that their money is being used now to torture the South Vietnamese prisoners. What you have to know is that the handcuffs used inside the South Vietnamese prisons are American-made handcuffs, Smith & Wesson handcuffs. The vomitive grenades being used during the repression against the political prisoners, these are American-made vomitive grenades from Salzburg, a company in Pennsylvania. When Mr. Nixon is speaking of peace with honor in South Vietnam, you have to know that there is still an American company, which name is the RMK, BRJ company, which still build new tiger cages in camp number 7 and camp number 8 of the Pulo Condor Island. When I was in this prison, I could meet with the American advisor inside. Every prison has an American advisor. In the Conson Island, his name is Colonel Jorgensen. Inside the Tiwa prison, I even met with an American consul whose name was Mr. Gambleton. He worked in the American embassy in Saigon. He was told about the repressions, the tortures, the deportations of all these political prisoners, but nothing was never made to improve these conditions. That's why I believe that the keys of these Vietnamese prisons are in this country. The Nixon administration has signed the Paris Agreement. The 27th of April 1973, all the political prisoners in South Vietnam were due to be released. We are in September. None of them has been released until now. If I am here today, that's because I believe that now that you know, you are willing to do something for these political prisoners. You must do and you can do something to save these political prisoners from death and to get them released before it is too late for them. When I was still in jail and when French public opinion get concerned about my plight, when thousands of French people wrote me letters inside the prison, then I was no more beaten. When demonstrations inside this country, inside the United States, take place, we heard about these demonstrations inside the prison. And you can imagine easily how it was important for the morale of all these political prisoners. When we smuggled out letters denouncing the tortures inside the prison, and when these letters were printing in French newspapers like Le Monde or the New Observer, immediately the tortures stopped, and even the family visits were allowed for these political prisoners. But when silence came again, the tortures began again. That's why I think that your protest must not be a protest of only one day. You have to protest constantly. You have to write to your senators. You have to put pressure on the Nixon administration, on the Thieu regime, to get these political prisoners being released. I still receive letters from these prisoners inside the prison. And I've learned that many of my friends have already died. One of them, whose name was Quoy, I received a letter from his wife. He has 2 children. His wife told me that, wrote me, I am half alive, I am half dead, but I will go on doing what he started. Another one of these political prisoners who died is Fung, the prisoner who was tortured with a needle. Fung died on the 5th of January 1973, only 1 week after I left the prison. And I can still remember the last image of Fung, the 28th of December 1972, when I left him. He was lying on the ground of cell number 10 in the ID sector, together with about 10 other students, like Winton Nam, a student leader. They had been on a hunger strike for more than 12 days. And Fung told me that he felt optimistic about the prospect of the Paris Agreement to be signed. Then, 1 week later, I learned that he died inside the cell because he was given a mysterious shot in the dispensary, which was the ID sector. A few days later, his wife, Kauti Kweung, was also rearrested, and she is now tortured inside the National Police. When I speak about the movie room, when I speak about the tortures in South Vietnam, what you have to know, what you have to try to imagine, that tonight, just while I'm speaking now, student girls are being raped in South Vietnam. Students, professors are being tortured inside the same cells, inside this movie room. Just before I left, this was in December 1972, while Mr. Nixon was still bombing North Vietnam with B-52. One of the students told me, his name was Kong, he told me, in the harbor of New York, the Statue of the Liberty has no more flame. It is ourselves, we, the Vietnamese students, by our struggle, who will light this flame again. That's why I believe that we owe our solidarity to these political prisoners. We owe them our solidarity, not only because their struggle, because there is an American responsibility for it, but because they struggle not only for their own survival, not only for the future of South Vietnam, but for our human dignity, for all of us. Thank you.
When Jean-Pierre talks, it is sometimes a great burden for us to hear the horror stories and to know that the lives of these people are in our hands. But he, along with the Vietnamese people that I've met, have somehow helped me deal with this, because they always say, don't be afraid, come smile with us. Take my hand, or I may have to leave the room. Please end your story soon. It's not like me to run away, but I don't know if I can stay. But here is a hand resting on my shoulder to ease the pain, to ease our shame. It's a flower that floated across the sea. She lives to set her people free. She is Vietnam and she comforts me, and with the rarest kind of smile, she says to me, oh, come smile with us.
It helps to make the days seem less like years. Oh, come smile with us, smile beneath your tears. Oh, come smile with us, it helps to make the days seem less like years. Oh, come smile with us, smile beneath your tears. Oh, come smile with us, it helps to make the days seem less like years. Oh, come smile with us, smile beneath your tears. Come sing with us. Oh, come smile with us, it helps to make the days seem less like years. Oh, come smile with us, smile beneath your tears. Oh, come smile with us, it helps to make the days seem less like years. Oh, come smile with us, smile beneath your tears. Oh, it helps to make the days seem less like years. Oh, come smile with us, smile beneath your tears. Why do we call them the enemy? This struggling nation that we bombed across the sea. And why do we want these people to die? Why do we say north and south? Oh, why, oh, why, oh, why? Well, that's just a lie. It's one of the many, and we've had plenty. I don't want more of the same. No more genocide in my name. Oh, why are our history books so full of lies when no word is spoken of why the Indian died, or that the Chicano loves the California land? Do our books all say it was discovered by white man? Well, that's just a lie. One of the many, and we've had plenty. I don't want more of the same. No more genocide in my name. Oh, why are the weapons of the war so young? And why are there only older men around when it's done? Why are so many of our soldiers black or brown? Do we say it's because they're good at cutting yellow people down? Well, that's just a lie. It's one of the many, and we've had plenty. I don't want more of the same. No more genocide in my name. Well, that's just a lie. It's one of the many, and we've had plenty. I don't want more of the same. No more genocide, no, 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 no more genocide, no, 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 no more genocide in my name.
Holly's going to come back in a little while and sing some more. In one of the verses of the last song she just sang, she asked a question about why do the history books lie so much. And I think we all know what an incredibly powerful tool history books are. I was just reminded of that today when a woman told me that she'd heard in Chile the history books are being burned so that the children, tomorrow's people there, will not know who Allende was, why he came to power, and all the struggles that have taken place before. We can understand how important the writers of history are when we watch the television programs that are probably going to be shown to us between now and 1976, the programs that are going to be celebrating the American bicentennial, that are going to tell us probably everything but the most important truths about our own history. We can see how important culture has been in defining for us our own faces as Americans, the origins of our own history. The movies that we've seen, many of them made by my father, unfortunately, although he doesn't believe this, but the movies that have portrayed Indians in a particular kind of way. Why has it taken so long for books like Bury My Heart, It Wounded Me to become bestsellers? Why do we have to look back with nostalgia at a time that we now can recognize was genocidal? How was it that a man like Custer ever became an American hero? And we all, too, I think, by now can recognize that a series of administrations have gone to great pains to give the Vietnamese a particular kind of mask, have prevented the American people from knowing who they are, why they have fought against us, and what the nature of the war has been. And we feel, and it's one of the most important areas of the work that we're trying to do, we feel it's terribly important for American people, if we are to learn the lessons of the war and regain our sanity, and if we are to prevent such things from ever happening again, we must understand who these people are that are changing American history from 10,000 miles away. There are many windows that we can look through to learn these lessons, but because I'm a woman, because I'm an actress, because of my own, the way I've changed in relation to the war, the window that I've chosen to look through is the women's window onto Vietnam. I was, as you probably know, a painfully short time ago floating through the air with a lot of blonde hair as Barbarella. It was really a very short time ago. And I was quite numb and apathetic and ignorant as to the meaning of American foreign policy. And I owe a great deal. The reason I changed was because of two things. First of all, people, probably many of yourselves, American people who have been aware far longer than I have, and who have been protesting far longer than I have, and who forced latecomers like me to have to face some realities that we didn't want to face, or that we were too lazy or selfish to face. And for that I'm very grateful, particularly the soldiers, the many, many soldiers who went over believing in the war, who went over to kill the Kong, and who came back and who had the guts, and I think it's probably the hardest for them, to stand up and say we were wrong. We did unspeakable things, and we want to tell the American people about it now, and we should all be extremely grateful to these eyewitnesses who had the courage to change. And I'm also very grateful to the Vietnamese, and in particular the Vietnamese women, who during a very short period of time when I was there, made me, I think probably forever, forsake cynicism. I don't think I'll ever be able to be cynical again about people's possibility for strength and courage. I was there at the time of the most heavy bombing, and I expected to see a frightened, poor, struggling, but weakened people, and I found, and I am not romanticizing, the most incredibly strong and overwhelmingly optimistic people that I have ever met in my life. People who were not afraid to love each other, who were having children all over the place, who were writing poetry all the time. There was a very, very long and very famous poem had just appeared in the major newspaper there, and the last verse of it was written to Nixon, and it was about the 1972 offensive, and it ended like this: "Nixon, we will fight you with all the joys of a woman in childbirth." And it says a lot. It says a lot. And with that, I would like to share this window with you that I and a lot of other women in the Indochina Peace Campaign have put together. And after that, Holly will sing some more, and then we would like to talk about what we can do about what you've been seeing tonight. These are some words from a Vietnamese poet. Who are you, sister, young girl or angel? How old are you, or have you no age? Is this your hair, or clouds, or stream? Are those your eyes that look at me, or is it the lightning in the storm? Is your body of flesh or bronze? Wake up, sister. The nightmare is over. You live again, sister. The searing electric shock, the piercing point, the brilliant knife, the consuming fire could not kill you, heroic girls. Your heart, sister, your heart so great, with one drop of blood it will beat again, and it will not beat for you alone. It will beat for justice, for your native village, for your country, for humanity, with that flame of confidence, the gleam and confidence of your native land. Oh, my daughter, sister of Vietnam. This Vietnamese poem was not dedicated to an unusual or mythical heroine. It was dedicated to the courage and suffering of millions of women in Vietnam who are struggling now and who have struggled for many, many centuries against the most powerful and desperate odds. Let us look at the nature of their oppression and try to understand the ways in which Vietnamese women have, for so long, labored for their own liberation and the liberation of their children. For centuries, Vietnamese peasants, and women in particular, suffered under the brutal exploitation of the Vietnamese feudal lords. Polygamy and child marriage, both excellent means of exploiting women's labor, were approved by law. While a man could take as many wives as he pleased, an unfaithful woman was sentenced to be trampled by elephants or have her head shaved. Confucianism, which was brought to Vietnam by the Chinese, had inspired a whole system of moral principles which helped to build up the idea that the woman was a weak and helpless creature who must live under man's protection. Written in the Confucian Book of Rights are such statements as, morals forbid women to step out of her room. Her only business is in the kitchen. It was in the late 18th century, when a decaying feudal society had turned women into commodities, that the Vietnamese national poem, Q, was written. In this great literary achievement, which can be ranked among the masterpieces of world literature, Vietnam is symbolized with the suffering and person of the heroine, named Q. Q is a beautiful and talented young woman, victimized time and time again by the cruel society of her time and forced into prostitution. In the course of a spring outing, stopping before the tomb of a courtesan, Q cries out, "How tragic is the destiny of women! How sad is their fate! Creator, why are you so cruel to us? Wasted are our green years, withered our pink cheeks." Through Q, the author portrays a concept which is basic to Vietnamese philosophy, that people are not born evil, but are shaped by their culture and society. Q eventually makes the fundamental judgment, which is also consistent with ideas in Vietnamese culture, that it is better that I should sacrifice myself alone, she says, for it matters little if one flower falls, if the tree can keep its leaves green. The period of feudalism which gave birth to Q was followed by what became nearly 100 years of colonial domination by the French. Under colonialism, the Vietnamese woman, besides suffering the common degradation of all colonized people, continued to be oppressed by men. She became the slave's slave, as is graphically illustrated in this photo taken in Hanoi in the early 1900s. It was the custom for the wealthiest French colonialists to employ eunuchs as household servants. These 4 women are carrying a eunuch servant who was holding a French baby. In the 1800s, at the height of French colonial domination, Ho Chi Minh was born. The people of Vietnam honor him as the founding father of independent Vietnam. And in the 1930s, Ho Chi Minh led a movement of the Vietnamese people against the French through the Communist Party. This was a decisive turning point in the struggle for national liberation and for the emancipation of women. Ho Chi Minh realized that the Vietnamese could never have equality and democracy as long as the Vietnam was controlled by the French colonialists. But he also recognized that no revolution could triumph without the full participation of women. He said, "Women make up half of society. If women are not liberated, then society cannot be free." The struggle for equality of the sexes was among the principal tasks of the revolution. The first women's union was founded at the very beginning of the national struggle for liberation. In order to determine what role women would play in the future of Vietnam, the Women's Union re-examined Vietnam's history in order to understand what the true role of women in society had always been. What became clear was that Vietnam had two principal characteristics: struggle against nature on the one hand, and struggle against foreign invaders on the other. Women, they learned, had participated in both to a degree unique to Vietnam. Unlike China, where for a period of time women's feet had been bound, crippling them into domestic slavery so they could not do field work, Vietnamese women had always labored in the fields alongside the men. And this cooperation between men and women has been a matter of survival. The very existence of Vietnam depends upon bringing the two elements, land and water, into harmony with one another. Thousands of years ago, most of the Red River Delta region of northern Vietnam was a vast marshland. When the original tribespeople came down from the mountains, they first had to win back the land from the sea and conquer the flood rains during the monsoon season before the land could be cultivated. Working together, they built a vast and complex system of dikes out of earth with their hands. Without these dikes, the Vietnamese nation could not exist. They are the work of an entire people, men and women toiling together in the spirit of cooperation and interdependence, which is so close to Vietnamese life. It is this same spirit which is reflected today in the way Vietnamese women have defended their country against the air war. During the heaviest U.S. bombing raids, an American visitor to North Vietnam driving through the countryside at dawn witnessed an extraordinary sight, though commonplace to Vietnam. Hundreds of singing women working together carrying mud in their hands to fill in the bomb craters which had shattered their dikes. The other principal characteristic of Vietnam's history is her resistance to outside domination. Vietnam is a rich land with many important resources: rice, rubber, tin, and oil. Because it borders on the sea and lies between India and China, Vietnam's geographical location has always had strategic military importance for nations interested in territorial expansion. For thousands of years, many countries have invaded Vietnam, tried to take the land away, tried to take the people away from the land. The struggle to control their own land is what the Vietnamese people call a national question, and women's role in this struggle has always been a central factor. For example, 43 years after the birth of Christ, the very first national insurrection to rid Vietnam of the Chinese feudal lords was organized by women. The famous Trung sisters put on their dead husbands' armor, slowly gained the confidence of the women, and mobilized an army led by 36 women generals, including their own mother. For 3 years they managed to maintain their national independence. The Trung sisters' valiant resistance is celebrated today in Vietnam with parades such as this to commemorate the first time the Vietnamese people rose up as one nation against foreign domination. In the centuries which followed, women would continue to participate fully in revolts against both foreign aggression and the feudal landlords who kept peasants in slavery. And in the example of the Trung sisters and the thousands of nameless peasant heroines who succeeded them, the Women's Union realized that a truly Vietnamese revolution would not succeed without the full participation of women. True to their own history, Vietnam's women responded overwhelmingly to the call to free their land of the French colonialists. By the 1950s, there were 840,000 women guerrillas in North Vietnam and 140,000 in South Vietnam. They were part of the National League of Independence called the Viet Minh. It included Vietnamese from all walks of life. Peasants, intellectuals, and even landlords were welcomed into the ranks of the resistance. A Vietnamese woman who now teaches in Hanoi explains the people's faith, the Vietnamese people's faith, in their ability to change and their lack of sectarianism when she recalls that sometimes the Vietnamese feudal lords wanted to join the guerrilla forces, but they had become so used to being carried in litters on the shoulders of their women servants that they were no longer able to walk any distance. So they would send word to the guerrillas, who would carry them into the jungle on their shoulders and would tend to their needs until these new patriots could walk again. Despite massive American support which had financed 80% of the French war effort, the Viet Minh defeated the colonialists in 1954 at the historic Battle of Dien Bien Phu. It was the first time that a small, technologically underdeveloped country had defeated a Western colonial power militarily. The Geneva Accords which followed called for a temporary division of Vietnam into two military regroupment zones, North and South. The two zones were to be reunited through popular elections 2 years later. The elections were never held, however. Eisenhower said had they been held, Ho Chi Minh would have won by 80% of the vote. She still feels her peasant roots. During an interview, she said, "If I am here in high command, it is because the people taught me. But I am no different than thousands of other women. I am merely one of them. And how many combatants have fallen, women and men, who could have filled my post?" While the Vietnamese in the north have been building a new and independent society where a women's union claiming 4 million members has achieved in only 27 years of revolutionary development vast progress in the emancipation of women, the people in the south have had to struggle to free their land of the foreign domination of the United States and its extension, the Saigon regime. Many of us have heard tragic stories of the violence that has been committed during the ground war by American GIs against Vietnamese women in particular. All men who enter the U.S. Armed Forces do so with preconceived ideas about women as sexual objects. For example, we have all seen countless women, some half naked, used in newspapers, magazines, and on TV to sell products of all kinds. Billboards, radios, and movies turn out the message that women can never be trusted, that they're stupid or weak, or are to be judged by the shapes of their bodies. In the military, these stereotypes are developed. In basic training, for example, a sergeant will shout at GIs who hesitate or fall behind, "You guys are a bunch of pussies," or some other insult that relates weakness and failure to women. At the rifle range, they may be told by the training officer, "Squeeze the trigger like you squeeze your girl's tits." GIs have reported that in basic training, NCOs joke about cheap slant-eyed pussy. The logical extension of this kind of indoctrination, plus the pressures of active combat on the GIs, seeing their buddies killed, for example. This has been documented by the GIs themselves. Sergeant Scott Camille, 1st Marine Division, reported at the Winter Soldier investigation, quote, "I saw one case where a woman was shot by a sniper. When we got up to her, she was asking for water, and the lieutenant said to kill her. So they ripped off her clothes. They stabbed her in both breasts and shoved an entrenching tool up her vagina. She was still asking for water, and then she was shot," unquote. Spec 4 Joe Calbally from Americal Division said, quote, "These people are aware of what American soldiers do to them, so naturally they try to hide the young girls. We found one hiding in a bomb shelter in sort of the basement of her house. She was taken out and raped by 6 or 7 men in front of her family," unquote. Difficult as it is to deal with these realities, there are some Vietnam veterans who have been able to speak about them and organize against them, against their experiences in Vietnam, because they have begun to understand the nature of sexual violence in an aggressive colonialist war. The roots of this violence come from deep within our own culture, and they take their toll on women all over the world, including ourselves. Because of the razing of villages, because of the saturation bombing and defoliation of vast areas, South Vietnam has been turned from a country which was once 95% rural to a country which today is 65% urban. Saigon, a city built to hold 300,000 to 400,000 people, now holds 4 million former peasants. It has 2.5 times the population density of Tokyo. The people live in cardboard houses, houses made of Coke bottles, beer cans. In the cities, there is a conscious attempt to replace the traditional values of the village with new values, like owning a TV set or a Honda. An American planner has said that a Honda riding generation will be easier to work with than a buffalo riding one. So all methods identified as psychological warfare have been employed to destroy any national pride, all class consciousness, to drain away any semblance of human dignity. The same culture which has numbed or brutalized us in the United States is being exported to all parts of Indochina, controlled by U.S.-supported governments. He-Man westerns like this one playing at a movie house in Bangkok, Thailand, or the pornographic films which line the streets of Saigon, or the CIA-supported cultural clubs, or the books being sold there entitled School of Love or How to Seduce Men. This cultural assault by the United States is called cultural neocolonialism. The Asians call it Coca-Colonization. It is a policy designed to make South Vietnam a permanent part of the U.S. empire. To promote, for example, the model Vietnamese soldier stripped of all values or political understanding, who never talks about Vietnam in patriotic terms, who kills to survive, then seeks pleasure afterwards through sex. Life in the cities of South Vietnam, which are under Saigon control, is a total reversal of traditional Vietnamese values, which is most tragically apparent in how it has dehumanized the women in these areas. When U.S. forces occupied Vietnam, women could be seen each morning sitting on the ground outside of American bases waiting to serve the soldiers as laundry maids and prostitutes. Nearly 400,000 women were forced into prostitution while GIs were in Vietnam. The salary of a Saigon soldier or a Vietnamese worker is not enough to support a small family, and so wives and daughters have had to sell themselves to live. In an attempt to raise their price, many prostitutes underwent costly plastic surgery operations. A woman in the Mekong Delta, described in the Los Angeles Times February 29, 1972, as the Jackie Kennedy of Can Tho, runs a beautification parlor where during the time of U.S. occupation, thousands of surgical operations were performed to enlarge women's breasts and change the shapes of their eyes, making them round, to conform to the Western playboy's sexual standard. This is a billboard advertising a doctor whose phone number is seen there, a doctor who performs eye operations. He was a former AID doctor, an American doctor who found it more lucrative to perform plastic surgery operations. Most of these operations are performed not on prostitutes, but on the women in the upper classes of Vietnamese society. The wives, for example, of Generals Thieu and Ky have round eyes. These people who the American government is supposedly preserving as nationalist alternatives to communism in Vietnam have literally had their faces and bodies Americanized, as well as their minds, culture, and institutions. But outside of the Saigon control areas of South Vietnam, women play quite a different role. They play a central role in fighting for the freedom of their country. For example, there are 500,000 elderly women who make up what is known as the Association of Mothers of Fighters. During the time of the ground war, these women brought food and medicine to the guerrilla soldiers. One of the most important forms of struggle in South Vietnam was that of mass demonstrations in the provincial capitals and district centers to protest the raids of villages by U.S. and Saigon troops. Sometimes these demonstrations would involve the population of entire provinces. Tens of thousands of women participated in them, forming their hardcore. This political army of women became known as the Long-Haired Army. It was set up with a unified command and a centralized leadership capable of organizing millions of women throughout the country. Another task of the Long-Haired Army was to organize the soldiers of the Saigon Army. For example, at night, hundreds of these women, megaphones in hand, would go into the trees or grass outside of the Saigon posts and talk to the soldiers inside. If a woman had a relative inside, she might start off by chanting a poem, evoking memories of home and village life, and she would call him by name. Chan, be on the side of the people. Why should you let yourself be killed for the Americans? Come back to your village. Land has been set aside for you. According to the Chicago Daily News of last August, the desertion rate of the Saigon Army soared to 25,000 per month during the offensive of 1972. This desertion rate was partly the result of the brave work of these women in the Long-Haired Army. This is a map from Newsweek showing the areas controlled by the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam. They are the darker areas which you see here. As you know, the January Peace Agreement recognized the Provisional Revolutionary Government as a legal, legitimate government in South Vietnam with its own army and its own territory. In these zones, elections are held, like this one in Quang Tri Province, to establish people's councils. Land has been distributed to the people who work it. Women and men, doctors and surgeons, work in hospitals and clinics which have been opened in caves throughout the liberated zones. Schools and underground factories continue to operate even under the bombs. The arts play an integral part in the Vietnamese liberation struggle. In the jungle, theater and dance are taught to young women and men who perform patriotic plays for the peasants, even at the time of the heaviest bombing. Two prominent scientists, Professors Pfeiffer and Westing, have been the first Americans to officially visit the PRG-controlled areas. And Pfeiffer reports, quote, "The only soldier I saw was a kind of ceremonial soldier who was guarding one of the village headquarters. There was no feeling of coerciveness. The feeling we got," he said, "was of a very viable and secure government. The people, as far as we could see, were in full support of their government." This woman is Madame Nguyen Thi Binh, who is the foreign minister of the Provisional Revolutionary Government. And as such, she is one of the world's leading women diplomats. although U.S. officials have tried to diminish her importance by literally calling her a fishwife. One official said that, quote, her position is a sop to women's lib, unquote. Madame Bin received her education under the French colonial regime. She remembers, I learned French history, not our own history. They taught us that our ancestors were the Gauls. Now 46, she has participated continuously in the struggle for national liberation since she was 18 years old. She says, I can count the days, not weeks or months, that I have seen my husband. My children count the time they have seen me or their father in days. People say we are accustomed to this, but we have the same desires and wants as everyone else. The same. It is difficult to live as we do. A Vietnamese poem expresses the hardships of being a mother there. To be a mother in Vietnam is not an easy thing. Elsewhere, you teach your children to pick flowers. In our country, you teach them to go to the trenches. Elsewhere, mothers teach their children the sound of birds. We teach them to distinguish the roar of the B-52 from the terrible roar of the Phantom. Elsewhere, the only task is to teach one's children to become men and women. In Vietnam, more is required, to teach them to become heroes. Such is the task of mothers in my country. There are no more U.S. bombs in Vietnam now. There are no more American pilots or GIs. But a basic conflict remains between the majority of Vietnamese who want a completely independent country and a tiny minority with vast U.S. backing who have become sufficiently westernized to want the U.S. to stay, invest, and control in South Vietnam. And in the forefront of this small group is General Nguyen Van Thieu, shown here with General Key interrogating political prisoners. Thieu was trained in the United States at Fort Bliss and Fort Leavenworth. In the 1967 presidential elections, only those candidates approved by Thieu were allowed to run. The head of Saigon's Chamber of Commerce, who ran second, was immediately jailed and spent 5 years in prison. In the 1971 election, Thieu allowed only himself to run. And in the elections last August, the 4 candidates were all pro-Thieu. As one American observer noted, it was as if in this country you had 4 parties headed by Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Melvin Laird, and Eagle Crow. This election was in violation of the January Peace Agreement, which calls for general elections to be organized by a coalition that would include Thieu, as well as the Provisional Revolutionary Government, and a third force, the neutralist force, the people who are not communists but who are opposed to Thieu. But because he realizes that he could not survive an open political competition with the PRG and the neutralists, General Thieu relies solely on police and military rule. And instead of peace with honor, the American bombers have been replaced by the most massive police state in the world. This is a picture of part of the National Police Force, which numbers 120,000. No other government in the world deliberately assassinates tens of thousands of its own citizens. But the Saigon regime openly admits having executed 50,000 South Vietnamese civilians during the last 4 years as part of Operation Phoenix, devised by the CIA and headed by none other than William Colby, who has just been appointed by Nixon director of the Central Intelligence Agency. As you know, Air America is the Air Force of Southeast Asia of the CIA. No other government in the world has thrown as many of its citizens in prison for political reasons. But the Committee to Reform the South Vietnamese Prison System, a group of Catholic leaders, intellectuals, and legislatures, estimates that there are approximately 200,000 political prisoners in South Vietnam. Thieu's police apparatus is a nationwide system of political control which blankets the cities and reaches into even the remotest hamlets. The police carry out nationwide harassment and surveillance operations in the cities, enforcing the curfew at night and checking ID cards at major intersections in the daytime. This family is posing for an identity picture in front of Thieu's flag and an anti-communist slogan. They will be given a brown book with every family member's name listed. The names are then sent to a central police computer developed by Computer Sciences Corporation of El Segundo, California, which also trains the police to use them. These computers have made it possible for the Thieu regime to classify 11.5 million people. There are bio-dossiers classified for the entire adult population of South Vietnam within Thieu's zone of control. According to American writer Fred Branfman, recently returned from Saigon, the police make sweeps through the city at night, knocking at doors of thousands of families. If there are 7 people listed in a family's brown book, and there are 6 or 8 people in the house when the police come, then an arrest almost always follows. The people in the prisons, the vast majority of them are not communists. Many of them were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Some of them were simply there because they lost their government paper or ID card or refused to pay a bribe to a government official. But according to many Vietnamese estimates, as many as 50% of the prisoners are women. They're pregnant women. They're women who are nursing young babies. They're children as young as 11 years old, high school students, as well as rice farmers and monks and old grandmothers. But the vast majority of the prisoners are members of this neutralist force, the third force, who, if they were free, would run against Thieu in the elections. And one of the most well-known of Thieu's political prisoners is Madame No Bat Tan, a lawyer with a PhD from Columbia University who founded in 1970 the Women's Committee to Defend the Right to Live and the Dignity of the Vietnamese Women. The demands of this committee were that the right of women to organize be recognized, that the dignity of women be respected, that American troops be withdrawn, and that a coalition government be formed in South Vietnam. And in response, thousands of women were arrested and put in prison, including Madame No Bat Tan, who is shown here after a year in prison. She'd been carried to the military field court where she was to be tried as a national security risk. She's in the arms of her husband there because she had suffered an asthma attack which had brought on a heart attack. And she was not given medical care. She was taken back to prison, not put in a hospital, and she remained in prison until just now. She went on a hunger strike for 80 days, according to the most recent reports, has lost 40 pounds, is in danger of dying. We read yesterday in the paper that Thieu has agreed to release her, although she is not out of prison yet, but that he would release her. Probably this is a token gesture during the International Week of Concern for the South Vietnamese political prisoners. I guess he thinks that by making these kind of token releases of the most famous of his political prisoners that he can pacify international public opinion. Jane Barton was a field director for the American Friends Service Committee for 2 years in the Quang Ngai Hospital in Quang Ngai Province in South Vietnam. She worked there as a physical therapist and came into contact with many of the prisoners from the Province Interrogation Center. This is the center shown here. This is a partial view of the interrogation center, which holds 1,000 prisoners and which was built by U.S. Navy Seabees. This is a picture of people attempting to pass food over the barbed wire fence to their relatives inside. Among the prisoners inside is this woman, Nguyen Thi Mai, who has been in prison for 5 years. Mai was one of 42 villagers rounded up during an American military operation in 1968 about 3 miles from My Lai village. She said to Jane Barton, "The American soldiers walked into our house. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but they made me stand in a group of other villagers. The soldiers took my 2 children away from me, and I remember the eyes and tears of my baby as I last saw her. Then we were loaded into a truck and taken to the Quang Ngai Interrogation Center. I have been tortured with electricity and beaten with clubs many times, but I still don't know why I have been put in prison. Now the American soldiers who put me here have gone home to their country, and I too want to go home. Every day I've been in prison, I've worried about my children. I've heard that my village was destroyed by bombs. Where are my children now? If I am ever able to be released, can I walk the miles to my home only to find barren land? And if I should find my children alive somewhere, they probably won't recognize me, for they were just babies when I last saw them 5 years ago." This is the American Embassy in Saigon. The Nixon administration is responsible for what is happening here. Nixon calls it peace with honor, while using our taxes to subsidize 90% of the Thieu regime's annual budget in violation of the January peace agreement. Most of the money is funneled through the humanitarian-sounding programs like the Agency for International Development and Food for Peace. The U.S. supplies the handcuffs made by Smith & Wesson, the computers, trains the police. An American construction combine called RMK-BRJ, headquartered in Houston, Texas, has built most of the prisons, including 384 new tiger cages in 1971 with a $400,000 grant from Food for Peace. In contrast to the U.S.-created Frankenstein monster, however, are the poems being written by women inside the prisons, scratched on the wall, on bits of paper and cloth, and smuggled out by sympathetic guards. The following is part of a poem written by a young woman in the largest prison, the same prison that Jean-Pierre was in. It was written after many of her friends had been badly beaten for singing a liberation song on the anniversary of the founding of the National Liberation Front. On their trembling lips the rose blooms again. Chains cannot imprison a smile, and walls between cells cannot raise barricades between hearts. I have seen blood inscribing on the stained yellow wall, "Against the invaders we are determined to reconquer our tomorrow." Sing again, sing, so that in my heart the storm rumbles, and at last our songs will melt these fiery chains. And to close, I'd like to tell you a story, my own experience of meeting a woman who had been a political prisoner in South Vietnam. I met her a year ago, July, when I was in Hanoi. Her name is Min, and she's seated on the left with her hands in her lap. Min is 22 years old, and she comes from a province in South Vietnam, Binh Dinh province. She told me that she'd been a militia girl there, and her job had been to hide the soldiers from the NLF, the Viet Cong, in tunnels underground and bring them food and clothing and supplies, to hide them from the Saigon soldiers. I asked her why she had been doing this, why she had joined the resistance, and she told me stories about what it had been like for her to grow up in this village, where people had been exploited and jailed, and those who had protested had been killed, she said. And so she had joined the resistance. She said that she'd been put in prison 3 times and had been tortured, and 3 times had managed to escape from prison. And she described some of the tortures. She said the worst was the water torture, where soapy lime water had been forced down her throat until her stomach would swell up, and then the guards would jump on her stomach. After I finished interviewing Min, I was talking to some of the other people in the room, and I noticed that Min began to grow very silent, and she suddenly leaped from her seat and ran for the door, trying to escape the room. And the other women in the room ran to her side to stop her, and she began to fight like an animal. She thrashed her arms about very powerfully, trying to get out of the room, and it took 6 women to pin her to the ground. She was foaming at the mouth. She was thrashing her head about. They had to hold her tongue to keep her from choking. And she began to pant like an animal very rapidly, very rapidly. And suddenly a voice came from this woman, unlike any voice I have ever heard in my entire life. It was a deep, angry litany, repeating the same thing very, very rapidly, over and over and over again in this deep, angry Vietnamese voice. And I looked around the room, and almost everyone in the room was crying. I asked them what was happening, and they told me that Min was suffering a seizure. She was reliving the torture that she had undergone. They said that she has these seizures sometimes 5 times a day, sometimes for hours at a time. She was reliving the experience of having water poured in her mouth and her stomach jumped on. And I asked them what she was saying. And they told me, and they were crying in admiration for this woman. They said she was saying, "It doesn't matter what you do to me, I will never speak, we shall be free. It doesn't matter what you do to me, I will never speak, we shall be free." Over and over and over again. And when she recovered from this seizure, we went outside so that she could get some air, and she sat next to me and she took my hand and she looked at my eyes and she said to me, smiling, "When you go back to the United States, please thank the people there who have done so much and have protested so long to stop the war." The courage, I think, that was displayed to me, Min's courage, the courage of the other women in prison, justify an expression that many people who go to Vietnam hear. If you step out of your door, you will meet a heroine. This is a poem written about the women prisoners by the Association of Vietnamese Women in France. Because they love freedom and independence, peace and justice, because they refused to send their children into the ranks of an army under the command of a foreign country to fight against their own brothers, they were in prison. But who could put into a cage conscience? Who could chain the wings of thought? In spite of tears and wounds, blood and tortures, their poems keep blooming on the prison walls. Born behind bars, their songs fly away into the world and bring us this faithful message: love, hope, determination, courage. Every
gifts I always get without fail. I get 1 year older, and the war goes on, it still ain't over, and one more freedom fighter goes to jail. So happy birthday, children of such sorrow. Well, are you wondering what to do about tomorrow? There is one more present, though you've had it all along, and that's the courage to keep on singing freedom songs. Every year on my sister's birthday, 3 gifts she always gets without fail. She gets 1 year older, and the Saigon prison makes her inside smolder as one more freedom fighter rots in jail. So happy birthday, children of such sorrow. Well, are you wondering what to do about tomorrow? There is one more present, though you've had it all along, and that's the courage to keep on singing freedom songs. So every year on all of our birthdays, 3 gifts we've got to promise that we're gonna get without fail. We'll get 1 year wiser, and we'll spin our web like a healthy spider and get our freedom fighters out of jail. So happy birthday, children of such sorrow. Well, are you wondering what to do about tomorrow? Well, there is one more present, though you've had it all along, and that's the courage to keep on singing. That's the courage to keep singing. That's the courage to keep on singing freedom songs. Time made the decision that she'd understand that there were other people living in a land where women touched each other, men walk hand in hand in the daytime of their lives. And time made the decision that he'd take a chance, for if we don't take chances, we will never dance with people from all backgrounds. She had a different path, but it was the right time in their lives. So let us sing a song of coming together, and in this evening help us to understand that we have found a greater love while working hand in hand. That's the love that we decision that these two should meet to help us overcome the kind of struggles that we're going to meet, and the love we need for our lifetime. Now is the time, and with our help, time will decide that war must end. Flowers will no longer break, they'll only bend, and we will cross the ocean to finally meet our friends of a lifetime, 'cause this is our time. So let us sing a song of coming together, and in this evening help us to understand that we have found a greater love while working hand in hand. That's the love that we all have for Vietnam. For Vietnam. I sang my song of protest to the war that we waged. We met a man named Chester, over 80 was his age. He introduced Tom Hayden, and he welcomed me and James. He said he'd spoken out against the war over the radio back in 1954. Oh, America, I now can say your name without feeling bitter and without feeling ashamed. I traveled across your countryside, your cities and your towns, and I saw the friendly people come and turn my head around. Well, once we met a woman, she said, answer if you can. Do you mean we've been aggressing all this time in Vietnam? I thought that we'd been helping people fight to save their land. And her voice began to quiver as she cried, and her life began to change once she knew that they had lied. Oh, America, I now can say your name without feeling bitter and without feeling ashamed. I traveled across your countryside, your cities and your towns, and I saw the friendly people come and turn my head around. Oh, once we saw a table where students sat behind. Re-elect the president was what was on their mind. But a voice on the loudspeaker was clearing up some lies, and a student behind the table began to rise, saying, sorry folks, but I'm moving over to the other side. Oh, America, I now can say your name without feeling bitter and without feeling ashamed. I traveled across your countryside, your cities and your towns, and I saw the friendly people come and turn my head around. Oh, once we saw a woman as peaceful as she could be. She told a crowd of thousands that she wanted to be free. She said that us Americans could set her country free. This woman was a Vietnamese, and she took the time to come and talk to me. Oh, America, I now can say your name without feeling bitter and without feeling ashamed. I'll travel across your countryside, your cities and your towns, and I've seen the friendly people come and turn our heads around.
Well, peace lost the election, but we haven't lost our souls, and we must come together to crystallize our goals, and we must find a better way to let the people know, just like all the people in the song. Americans will sing once they know that things are wrong. Oh, America, I now can say your name without feeling bitter and without feeling ashamed. I travel across your countryside, your cities and your towns, and I saw the friendly people come and turn my head down. You sing this next one with me? You gotta hang in there a little bit longer, though I know it's been too long. For 27 years you have been fighting, 27 years you have been strong. When you farm, you hold a rifle, and when you sleep, you hold a child. When you fight to get a hold on the freedom, I'll feel stronger when I get to see you smile. But can you hang in there a little bit longer, though I know it's been too long. For 27 years you have been fighting, 27 years you have been strong. Well, there's a silver bird all filled with murder. You bring it down to save your rights. Well, still you ran to find the foreign pilot. You healed his wounds and you gave him back his life. But can you hang in there a little bit longer, though I know it's been too long. For 27 years you have been fighting, 27 years you have been strong. I have learned so much about living since I've seen you stay alive. I used to feel, well, hell, it ain't worth it, but now, dear friend, I don't want you to die. You've gotta hang in there a little bit longer, though I know it's been too long. For 27 years you have been fighting, 27 years you have been strong. Well, there's a prison cell all filled with darkness you can't see, but still you smile. There ain't no darkness gonna block out your vision. You know that if you die, there's gonna be another child who's gonna hang in there a little bit longer, though I know it's been too long. For 27 years you have been fighting, 27 years you have been strong. You gotta hang in there a little bit longer, though I know it's been too long. For 27 years you have been fighting, 27 years you have been strong. We want you to sing the song that we sang earlier together, Come Smile With Us. And those of you who have the desire to harmonize, it will sound really pretty from all of you. Also, I wanted to tell you that a record that Jeff Langley and I made together this spring of some of the songs you've heard, it's called Hang In There. It's on sale back there. And we don't want you to buy it for us to make any money, because we won't. We got a long way to go before we even break even, but we'd like you to share it with people, because sometimes it's a good way to tell people how you feel about the Vietnamese people is through music. There's also a Vietnamese song on there if you've never heard Vietnamese music. Oh, come smile with us. It helps to make the days seem less like years. Oh, come smile with us. Smile beneath your tears. Oh, come smile with us. It helps to make the days seem less like years. Oh, come smile with us. Smile beneath your tears. Oh,
come smile